On February 28, the Report on Human Rights Violations in the United States in 2021 was released. The report reveals that dozens of workers were trafficked to American farms to dig up onions with their bare hands. That's right. This is happening in the United States in 2021. Forced labor unlocks the grim history of America's greatest shame. How has forced labor played its role in American history? At the end of the 18th century, in order to expand cotton production, Southern plantation owners bought a large number of slaves for forced labor. On those cotton plantations, slaves were considered the private property of the plantation owners and could be bought, sold, beaten and abused at will. American cotton plantations were like concentration camps, where slaves worked all day long in the cotton fields. To make more money, plantation owners exploited black slaves with all forms of torture. They hired overseers who would beat the black slaves to a pulp with cowhide whips, forcing them to be more efficient when picking cotton. One of the slaves, Henry Bibb, recalled,
"At the sound of the overseer's horn, all the slaves came forward and witnessed my punishment. My clothing was stripped off and I was compelled to lie down on the ground with my face to the earth. 4 stakes were driven in the ground, to which my hands and feet were tied. Then the overseer stood over me with the lash and laid it on according to the deacon's order."
American cotton is stained with the blood and tears of black slaves who were forced to work. Guess the smear campaign against Xinjiang cotton by the U.S. is inspired by its own story. There is a psychological term called projection, which refers to placing your own negative traits onto others. Isn't that exactly what the U.S. is doing? In 1863, the U.S. began to build the Pacific Railroad. Due to the labor shortage, the railroad companies recruited a large number of Chinese laborers. From 1865 to 1869, more than 10,000 Chinese workers from Guangdong and Fujian worked on the transcontinental railroad tracks. They endured hardships and hard work and completed building the railroad in only 7 years, much faster than the 14 years as planned. But they also suffered endless abuse and humiliation. The Chinese workers were paid less than the white workers but were assigned the most exhausting and dangerous jobs. They placed explosives with their bare hands, resulting in a lot of casualties. To stay ahead of schedule, Chinese laborers were forced to work on freezing and snowy days. Many of them who came from southern China were frozen to death in their tents or lost their lives in avalanches. As a saying goes, under every sleeper there is the soul of a Chinese worker. However, it's a shame that not a single Chinese worker could be found in the photos celebrating the completion of the railroad. The U.S. lured Chinese laborers into digging gold mines and building railroads with the enticing lie that the streets are paved with gold, and treated them unfairly with forced labor, racial discrimination, and Chinese exclusion policies. Are these the American values that has been boasted about? While the American southern plantations relied on black slaves as the main labor force, it cannot be ignored that northern factories in the U.S. profited from child labor. They worked as drivers in coal mines, opened and closed doors in mines, crawled into chimneys to sweep up dust, operated machines in textile mills, harvested tobacco leaves, sold newspapers, and made furniture. American child laborers and subsequent exploitation can be found in all trades. Once an 8-year-old child was forced to climb into a chimney that had just gone out to sweep the soot and got stuck in the chimney. He wasn't found until after he was tragically burned. American tobacco farms have also been hiring children to harvest tobacco, dry tobacco leaves and even operate heavy machinery. Children working on those tobacco farms often experience nausea and headaches, nicotine poisoning and even lung infections.
美国约有50万名童工从事农业劳作，很多孩子从8岁起开始工作，每周工作时长达72小时。2003至2016年间，美国有237名童工死于农业事故。
In addition, modern slavery is also taking place in U.S. prisons. As the crime rate in the U.S. remains high, the public prison system in the U.S. is overwhelmed with inmates, hence the boom of private prisons. Currently, there are more than 200 private prisons in the U.S., housing around 120,000 inmates who are subjected to forced labor. Children in prisons are required to work 10 to 12 hours a day, while adult prisoners are forced to work 14 to 16 hours a day. Most prisoners in the U.S. are paid only 20 to 40 cents an hour. What's worse, those prisoners are also forced to carry out hazardous tasks, such as carrying the bodies of dead COVID-19 patients and putting out wildfires in California. When prison becomes a business, profit becomes the dominant driving force. The poor may end up pleading guilty because they can't afford bail. To ensure adequate occupancy and sufficient supply of cheap labor and being driven by the notion that more prisoners are wanted, not less. 2 judges in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, received millions of dollars in bribes from private prison operators between 2003 and 2008, and sent more than 2,000 juveniles to private prisons on felony convictions instead of misdemeanors without legal representation. From antebellum black slaves to modern-day immigrant workers, forced labor has become an ugly but prominent scar that will be permanently marked on American history. Forced labor is a byproduct of slavery, and it is unfathomable that slavery was not officially abolished in Mississippi until 2013. The U.S. has demonstrated to the world how forced labor works with its own best practices.